Yeah, and at the end of the day, for Cuba, for all its problems and whatever, if you're a gun to my head and you're picking like a random country to have to be born in the Caribbean, like say you're getting chosen like randomly born in Haiti,
Right.
randomly born in Puerto Rico. I mean, I guess you can say you were forced to stay in Puerto Rico, like you can't
Yeah,
emigrate to
yeah.
the United States. Or Cuba, like you're taking Cuba every time. Like the quality of life in
Hmm.
Cuba is objectively higher than in any of those island nations. Not counting Puerto Ricans who can come to the United States. I mean, the Puerto Ricans that stay there, like look at what happened after Hurricane Maria. You don't hear the same thing happen when Cuba gets hit by a hurricane because it happens all the time.
And they have one of the best, well, probably the best, like hurricane evacuation and control system in the world, right?
Yeah,
That like it's unreal, right? The person from your local, committee for the defense of revolution, will show up and say, okay, here's your spot, right? For the shelter up in the mountains, right? And you go up there. They take your fridge to a safe place, so your fridge isn't
yeah,
damaged in the hurricane. You can take your household pets with you, and people pretty much do not die in hurricanes in Cuba,
in
right?
Cuba.
Even
Yeah,
though it happens all the time, right? And
yeah,
and Haiti, for example, obviously is absolutely devastated. The human consequences when hurricanes come through, and of course the U.S. right is not nearly as good at Cuba is at this, right? Like that famously, um, Fidel Castro offered to
yeah,
send Cuban doctors and supplies to help New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina,
yeah,
and obviously the Bush administration said no, right? But like
yeah,
that's just the same way that there are Cuban doctors who are in various countries right now helping with the COVID crisis, and relative to being this very small, very poor country, can't get a lot of medical equipment, that's sold in the U.S., et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Like their track record handling COVID has been pretty good, right? Like, I'm sure there are other countries, for first world countries, not the U.S., that you'd
yeah.
rather be dealing with the COVID crisis in, than Cuba, right? But like certainly, um, by the standards of third world, I mean, they've been killing it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's just, and people don't realize, this is something that Daniel Bressner talks about a lot. Is like just people don't realize how powerful the United States is, even in its kind of like this like kind of weird late empire phase where like no one really has a stomach for it anymore, and like no one in the population actually believes anymore. Like you don't really see that many true believers anymore. You're seeing kind of like, take the money and run type people, but not really like the sort of true believers that, you and I are old enough to remember, like the late 90s and stuff, the triumphalism, the belief that like inherent belief in America is just like the superior. Like no one really believes it. No one makes that case anymore. Like when the politicians say it's like not landing the same way as it used to. Um, but yeah, I mean this idea that like the United States is because of that weak is laughable. Like, I mean, the United States military is still like unbelievably powerful, even if it's like run by bumbling idiots. But it's still like, just like again, like you said, the 500-pound gorilla in the room. And economically, as we're struggling here within the United States, and like the majority of people, like in the United States are kind of downwardly mobile and struggling, it still is this like overwhelming power in dictating global economic affairs, certainly in the Western hemisphere. So
Yeah,
yeah,
well,
like
so
the
so
idea that,
speaking of which, right?
yeah,
So we're going through the Western Hemisphere, right? Which we talked a
sure,
little bit about Honduras, we talked a little bit about Venezuela. The obvious case in terms of recent, right, U.S. supported coups, because I think a lot of times there's this sort of way that apologists for U.S. imperialism will kind of try to classify like the greatest hits, your Guatemala in
yeah,
1954, your Chile in 1973, these things, support for the Contra death squads in Nicaragua in the 80s, and say, okay, well, that was bad, sure, right? Like it's
That
not
was Cold
ideal.
War stuff. We made some mistakes, but like we were fighting the Soviet
Yeah, we were
Union.
just getting a little overzealous in our efforts to fight the
Yeah.
Soviet Union in the Cold War. So, but it doesn't really represent anything like more significant about that, right? About the basic relationship between the United States and Latin America. But all the cases we've been talking about just now have been very recent, right? In fact, actually, before we get to Bolivia, I do want to make sure this doesn't get lost, right? Because we were talking about
Yeah.
Reagan earlier, and the continuity is striking, right? So Elliot Abrams was
The same people. Yeah.
yeah. Well, actually, here, tell us about Elliot Abrams, because again, this is a figure. It's like somebody who is, I don't know. I guess I'm dating myself here, but it's like a beloved character from Cheers showing up on Frasier, right? You know, that like it's
Right.
it's that kind of thing for the history of U.S. imperialist meddling in Latin America.
Yeah, I mean, Elliot Abrams was kind of, I don't even know what his official title must have been in the Reagan administration. It was probably something vague, kind of like special envoy to Central America or whatever, but he was basically in charge of U.S. policy in Central America in the time of the Dirty Wars, which is very poorly understood here. I mean, when you tell people the amount of people that were killed in the Central American Dirty Wars, like their jaw just, I mean, it's like talking about like 500,000 people probably that were killed, if not more. And some of these countries are not very big. You know, these are very, very small countries. You know, El Salvador and Nicaragua. Very, very countries. And Elliot Abrams was basically the man giving cover to the U.S.-sponsored death squads in Guatemala and El Salvador and places like this that received U.S. funding, training, all manner of things to basically disappear the left. You know, that's basically, that was their job. It was to make sure the left disappeared by any means necessary. If you read Vincent Bevins' great book, The Jakarta Method, I mean, this was the policy kind of that was invented in Indonesia in 1965 and taken throughout the world, but especially in Latin America, is that if you disappear the people rather than kill them publicly, you kind of have the effect of, not to use like an overused term, but like gaslighting the population, right. Because they don't know what happened. Like they just never really know what happened to them. You always kind of hold out hope. And Elliot Abrams was like the butcher of Central America. Like, I mean, he was the guy in charge of like taking some dopey New York Times reporter, and telling him like, nope, yeah, these guys are freedom fighters, and and the New York Times reporter's like, well, checks out, like, and then as the quote unquote liberal media is wont to do, whenever right. like some NatSec ghoul just tells them like, nope, actually what we're doing is actually good. That stuff that you're hearing, all communist propaganda. Okay, well, and now he's back. He's back in black, baby. Like you said, the continuity. This is not ancient history. This is U.S. policy that transcends administrations, transcends partisan lines.
So tell us a little bit about this, right? What's his role been in the last year?
So he's the special envoy to Venezuela. And I mean, basically what it's been is to coordinate efforts with the Venezuelan opposition, which is this kind of comically inept, fractured, and, but also like kind of very, very extreme and potentially violent faction, very well funded by like the Venezuelan elite, both in...
By the way, I do have to say, right, I love, I think one of the revelations in Steve Bannon's book is that Donald Trump had referred to Juan Guaido, right, the guy who attempted to install as president of Venezuela, as the Pete Buttigieg.
The Beto O'Rourke.
Oh, sorry. Actually, that's even better. Yes, the Beto O'Rourke.
Yeah, it is better because it's more accurate. Like he is, like Pete Buttigieg is like a psychopath who, like, you can imagine being, the next like bigwig. Maybe he's not going to become president, but he'll be like some major power player in Democratic Party politics. Right. He is a true psychopath that is going to like get there some way, shape, or form. Like he's going to replace Neera in a cap or something. And then be the chief of staff for Kamala Harris, whatever. Beto O'Rourke is a loser. Like he's just like a dopey kind of Gen X dumbass.
People like he had a lot of goodwill, right, for progressives when he was running against Ted Cruz. And then, he was clearly going through some kind of identity crisis because now he wasn't running for anything, and
Right.
and then he felt lost and disoriented, so he tried to run for president, and he did a lot of like standing on tables and tree stumps and stuff, but like
Yeah.
it got sadder and sadder as it went
Yeah.
on, which is not a bad analogy. In fact,
No,
for Juan Guaido spending like actually, whatever you think, as you're saying, right, about Maduro and anything that that government in Venezuela might have done wrong or mistakes they might have made or any of that stuff, right? There was a hilarious disconnect because there was a long time when Juan Guaido was doing things like going around to military bases saying, "I'm the real president, follow me." Everybody just kind of laughed at him and ignored him, and he wasn't even being arrested, by this government, which was honestly a propaganda masterstroke by the Maduro government, because it's like, hey, you know what? What's gonna like the disconnect is gonna be so amazing here, right? Because they're talking about how we're Stalin, and like we're just gonna let this idiot like walk around, like go around and like tour
right.
military
Like,
bases.
the fact that this guy's not been executed yet, like what the hell? Juan Guaido goes around with a full-time paid astrologer.
Awesome.
Like he has a guy on staff, and that's his job, to be his as an astrologer or astrologist. I don't know. But yeah. Somehow he's running around this like authoritarian government country trying to overthrow the government, and he's still not in jail or executed. But
somebody,
I mean,
somebody in chat says there are no attempts to get mercenaries to support Beto, but if there were, he would find a way to fuck it up. I mean, that's the point.
Right, totally. But it's interesting, because and this is something that Mike Brooks and I used to talk a lot about, but because there's there's a lot of talk about like the authoritarianism of people like Maduro or Chavez or Castro, a figure like Chavez, who's on the left but came through the military, has been able, in many ways, the Venezuelan regime has been able to withstand sort of the basically the attacks from the United States and its own kind of internal elites, mostly because of their support of the support from the armed forces, mostly because they come from the armed forces. Like, this is not something we would want to happen, but like it's just a reality that the Venezuelan military still supports Maduro, and that is why he will be in power. And right. Castro, fought, like, was a military, was in a way, he didn't come from like an official, like regular army the way Chavez did, but he was a military guy, commander in the field. And that allowed him to enjoy kind of the support of the armed forces. Whereas someone like Lula in Brazil or Evo Morales in Bolivia do not come from the military. So they're always going to be vulnerable to the right-wing authoritarian coup.
Yeah, right, exactly.